O Estado de S Paulo, also known as Estadão, is a daily newspaper published in São Paulo, Brazil. It is the third largest newspaper in Brazil and its format is broadsheet. It has the second largest circulation in the city of São Paulo, behind only Folha de S Paulo. The journal was founded on 4 January 1875 and was first called a Província de São Paulo, an active supporter at the beginning of the military dictatorship in Brazil which lasted from 1964 to 1985. O Estado de S Paulo is described by observers as having a right-wing, conservative editorial stance. It is considered a newspaper of record for Brazil. The term província was preserved until January 1890, 1 month after the fall of the monarchy and the subsequent republican regime in Brazil. Although the newspaper supported the change, it showed that it was completely independent, refusing to serve the interests of the ascendant Republican Party of São Paulo. When the then editor-in-chief Francisco Rangel Pestana left to work in a project of the Constitution in Petrópolis, the young editor Júlio de Mesquita effectively took control of Estado and initiated a series of innovations. One of the innovations was the engagement of the agency Avis. Once the largest in the world, the Estadão pioneered the newspaper selling system in 1875, where it was sold on the streets, instead of by the subscription-only system adopted by all other newspapers in Brazil before that time. At first, this new way of selling resulted in jokes and mockery, but ultimately all rivals adopted the same system. Today, newspapers in Brazil are sold in small street newspapers, magazines, shops, and by single sellers located in the main avenues of the biggest cities. Back in the 19th century, the Estadão was sold by only one man, a French immigrant, who carried his newspapers in a bag, while riding a horse, and announcing himself with a cornet. In the end of the 19th century, the Estado was already the largest newspaper in São Paulo, exceeding the circulation of the Correio Paulistano. Property of the Mesquita family since 1902, the Estado supported the Allied cause in World War I, suffering reprisals from the German community in the city, which removed all advertising announcements from the newspaper. Despite this, the Mesquitas maintained their editorial position. During the war, the afternoon edition of the newspaper began to circulate throughout the country. It was known as Estadinho, directed by the then young Júlio de Mesquita Filho. In 1924, the newspaper Estado was banned from circulation for the first time, after the defeat of the tenants' rebellion that shook the city. Júlio Mesquita, who tried to mediate a dialogue between the rebels and the government, was imprisoned and taken to Rio de Janeiro, before being freed shortly thereafter. With the death of the old director of 1927, his son Júlio de Mesquita Filho assumed the directory along with his brother Francisco, the latter managing the financial aspects of the newspaper. In 1930, the Estado, connected to the Democratic Party, supported the candidature of Getúlio Vargas for the Liberal Alliance. With the victory of Vargas, the newspaper saw the Brazilian Revolution of 1930 as a mark of the end of the oligarchy system. The so-called Grupo Estado assumed in 1932 the leadership of the constitutionalist revolution. With its defeat, many people from the directory were exiled, including Júlio de Mesquita Filho and Francisco Mesquita. 1 year later, in August, Getúlio Vargas invited Armando de Salas Oliveira to be the governor in São Paulo. Armando Salas, son-in-law of Júlio Mesquita, imposed as a condition for his acceptance the position the amnesty of the rebels of 1932 and a convocation of a constituent assembly. Vargas agreed and Júlio de Mesquita Filho and Francisco Mesquita, as well as other exiled people, returned to Brazil. Years later, with the appearance of the Estado Novo, the newspaper maintained its opposition to the regime and, in March 1940, it was invaded by DOPS and the paper was altered by them to state that, with absurdity and mockery, guns were arrested. In the redaction, the newspaper was initially closed and afterwards was confiscated by the dictatorship, being administrated by DEP until 1945. when the Estado was returned by the Supreme Federal Court to its legitimate owners. The numbers published during this governmental intervention are not considered part of the actual history of the paper. Shortly after World War II, the Estado enjoyed great advances, with the increase in editing and of its good reputation. In the 1950s, the major Quedinho Street headquarters were built, adjacent to the Hotel Jaragua. That was the phase when the section international of the newspaper, directed by the journalist Giannino Carter and by Ray Mesquita, became known as the most complete of any national newspaper. From that time until the 1970s, O Estado showed almost exclusively international news on its first page. D.